The storm rolled in without warning. Heavy rain pounded against the tin roof of the old barn, the wind howling through the cracks in the wooden walls. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the vast farmland for a brief second, before plunging it back into darkness. Tom Carter, a seasoned farmer in his late 50s, stood on his front porch, staring toward the barn. Something felt off. It wasn't just a storm. The barn had seen worse over the years. It was something else. Something eerie. Then he heard it. A sharp, desperate cry cut through the wind. It wasn't the sound of the storm or the creak of the barn's old hinges. It was different, soft yet urgent, almost pleading. Tom narrowed his eyes. Could it be an animal caught inside? Maybe a fox or an injured coyote? He grabbed his flashlight and raincoat, pulling the hood over his head before trudging toward the barn. His boots sank into the wet soil with each step, the cold wind biting at his face. As he reached the barn doors, another sound made him freeze, a loud, piercing screech from above. His heart pounded as he looked up. A falcon, its wings spread wide, was circling in the stormy sky. Its sharp eyes glowed in the lightning flashes, locked onto the barn. Tom had seen plenty of hawks and falcons in his life, but never one behaving like this. The bird wasn't hunting. It wasn't flying away from the storm either. It was watching, waiting. The desperate whimpering came again, this time louder. Something was inside. Tom unlatched the heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The rusty hinges groaned in protest. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of hay bales, old wooden crates, and dust swirling in the air. Rain dripped through the holes in the roof, forming small puddles on the ground. Then, in the farthest corner of the barn, he saw movement. He stepped forward cautiously, his breath hitching as the beam of light landed on a small, trembling shape. No, not just one. 3. Nestled in a pile of old hay were 3 tiny bear cubs, their fur damp and matted. They huddled together, their round eyes filled with fear. Tom's stomach twisted. Bear cubs? Alone? That could only mean one thing. Their mother was either missing or dead. Before he could process the situation, a sudden gust of wind blasted through the barn, and the falcon swooped in. Tom stumbled back as the great bird landed just a few feet away from the cubs, its talons gripping the wooden beam tightly. But it wasn't attacking. It was guarding them. Tom's mind raced. Why would a predator be protecting its natural enemy? It made no sense. Yet, as he watched, the falcon lowered its head toward the cubs, as if shielding them from a storm. Another flash of lightning lit up the barn, revealing something even more shocking. A small pile of half-eaten berries and scraps of meat lay beside the cubs. Food. The falcon had been feeding them. Tom swallowed hard. This wasn't just nature taking an odd turn. This was something else. Something he had never seen before. And whatever it was only the beginning. Tom Carter wasn't a man who scared easily. He had lived through the worst of storms, fought off wolves from his livestock, and seen the brutal ways of nature up close. But this was different. Standing in the dimly lit barn, staring at 3 helpless bear cubs guarded by a falcon, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: unease. The falcon's golden eyes met his, unblinking. It stood its ground, wings slightly outstretched as if daring him to come closer. The storm raged on outside, rattling the barn's wooden frame, but inside, a strange silence settled between man and beast. Tom took a cautious step forward. The falcon didn't flinch. "I don't know what's going on here," he muttered under his breath, shifting the beam of his flashlight over the cubs. They were tiny, far too young to be alone. Their mother should have been nearby, fiercely protective. But she wasn't. Instead, there was this bird, a predator standing guard over prey. The smallest cub whimpered, nuzzling against its siblings for warmth. Without thinking, Tom shrugged off his coat and carefully placed it over them. They flinched at first, but then settled into the warmth of the fabric. The falcon tilted its head, watching his every move. Tom crouched down, his mind racing. Where was the mother? Had she abandoned them? Been killed? He scanned the barn for clues. The straw was slightly disturbed, as if something larger had been here before. There were no fresh tracks leading in or out, just the storm-washed mud outside. Then he spotted something. Near the edge of the barn, almost hidden beneath a pile of old sacks, lay a single massive paw print. Tom's stomach tightened. The mother bear had been here. Recently. A sudden gust of wind slammed the barn door shut, making Tom jump. The falcon let out a low, warning screech, flaring its wings. The cubs whimpered again, curling tighter against each other. Tom exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. He had two choices: leave the cubs and let nature take its course, or take action. His instincts as a farmer told him to stay out of it. Wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous even. But something deep inside whispered that this was different. Very different. The falcon had been feeding them, protecting them, and now it was looking at him as if it expected him to do the same. Tom pushed himself to his feet. "All right," he muttered. "I don't know why I'm doing this, but let's get you little ones warm." He reached down, carefully gathering the cubs in his coat. They were lighter than he expected, their tiny bodies shivering against his arms. The falcon let out another cry, but this time it wasn't a warning. It sounded almost approving. As he stepped toward the barn doors, a chilling realization struck him. If the mother had been here recently, why had she left her cubs behind? And more importantly, was she coming back? Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying a deep, distant growl. Tom froze. He wasn't alone. Something was out there, watching, waiting. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. Tom Carter knew that feeling, the sensation of being watched. It prickled at the back of his neck, warning him to stay alert. He stood frozen at the barn doors, the bear cubs bundled in his coat, their tiny bodies warm against his chest. Outside, the storm howled through the trees, but beneath the wind's fury, there was something else. A sound, a deep guttural growl. Tom's fingers tightened around the cubs as his eyes searched the darkness beyond the barn. His flashlight flickered, barely cutting through the sheets of rain. The storm had masked whatever was lurking out there, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. The falcon let out a sharp screech from its perch, its wings flaring as if signaling a warning. Tom had seen birds react to danger before, but this felt intentional, like the falcon understood the threat in ways he couldn't. Then, in the distance, something moved. A shadow, massive and slow, just beyond the reach of his light. Tom's breath caught. The mother bear. She was alive. But she wasn't charging. She wasn't roaring in rage. She was standing still, watching. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished back into the darkness. Tom swallowed hard. Everything about this was wrong. A mother bear would never leave her cubs behind, especially not to a predator, and certainly not to a human. Yet, here he was, holding her babies in his arms while a falcon guarded them like a sentry. Something wasn't adding up. He needed answers. With one last glance into the storm, Tom turned and shut the barn doors, bolting them tight. The cubs whimpered softly in his arms, curling deeper into his coat. The falcon remained on its perch, eyes still trained on the doors as if expecting trouble. Tom exhaled and moved to the far side of the barn, gently setting the cubs down on a pile of fresh hay. They were exhausted, their tiny chests rising and falling in uneven breaths. "All right," he muttered, shaking the rain from his coat. "What in the world am I supposed to do with you?" The cubs didn't answer, of course. But the falcon did. It swooped down from the beam and landed just a few feet away, watching Tom with a steady, piercing gaze. Then, to his utter disbelief, it hopped forward toward the cubs and used its beak to nudge a few stray pieces of meat closer to them. Tom's jaw tightened. He had spent his whole life around animals. He understood their instincts, their habits. But this wasn't natural. This was something else. "Are you protecting them?" he asked aloud, half expecting the falcon to ignore him. Instead, the bird lifted its head, eyes locked onto his. And in that moment, Tom swore he saw something in those golden irises. Recognition. Understanding. The cubs nibbled weakly at the food, their tiny bodies shivering less now that they were safe. Tom ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to piece this all together. A mother bear that abandoned her cubs. a falcon that was feeding them. And now, that same bear lurking in the storm instead of reclaiming her young. Something unnatural was happening here. And Tom had the uneasy feeling that whatever it was, it had only just begun. Tom barely slept that night. The storm had passed, but an unsettling quiet had taken its place. Outside, the wind had died down, the trees stood still, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, had vanished. It was the kind of silence that made a man uneasy, the kind that hinted something was about to go terribly wrong. Inside the barn, the cubs lay curled in the hay, their tiny bodies rising and falling in peaceful sleep. The falcon remained perched on a wooden beam above them, its sharp eyes unblinking, as if standing guard. Tom sat on an old stool, staring at the animals before him, still trying to make sense of it all. He had spent his life raising cattle, working the land, and understanding the rules of nature. But this defied everything he knew. A falcon feeding and protecting bear cubs. A mother bear abandoning them but lingering nearby. And now, the creeping feeling that something or someone was watching. His gut told him trouble was coming. And he was right. Hashtag the stranger in the truck. Just as dawn broke, the sound of an approaching truck shattered the morning stillness. Tom's head snapped up. He recognized the deep, rumbling engine before he even saw the vehicle. Dale Grayson, a local hunter, the kind who took more than his fair share from the land. He was known for stretching the limits of what was legal, trapping out of season, hunting where he wasn't supposed to. And worse, he loved a good trophy kill. Tom's fists clenched as he stepped outside, the barn door creaking behind him. Sure enough, Dale's rusted black truck rolled to a stop just outside the fence. The man climbed out, his usual smug grin plastered across his face, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Mornin', Tom," Dale drawled, pushing his cap back. His eyes scanned the barn, then the tree line. "Heard some talk round town. Folks saying there's been a big OL bear sighting near your farm." Tom kept his face neutral. "That's so." Dale smirked. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would ya?" Tom's muscles tensed. He knew exactly what this was. Dale was sniffing around for an easy kill. A lone mother bear? Separated from her cubs? That was a prize too tempting for a man like him. Tom crossed his arms. "Not sure what you're getting at, Dale." Dale took a step closer, his boots crunching in the gravel. "Come on, Tom. I know you. You got a soft spot for strays, but this ain't some lost pup. It's a bear. Dangerous animal. If she's out there alone, well," he patted his rifle, "might be best if someone took care of it before she becomes a problem." Tom's blood boiled. He knew what Dale meant by problem. The cubs. Dale hadn't found them yet, but if he did, there was no telling what he'd do. Tom forced himself to stay calm. "I think you're wasting your time here," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Haven't seen any bears. You know how rumors spread." Dale narrowed his eyes, studying him for a long moment. Then, his gaze flickered toward the barn. Too long. Tom stepped forward, blocking his view. "You done here, Dale?" A slow smirk spread across the hunter's face. He wasn't fooled, but he wasn't going to push, yet. Instead, he took a step back, tipping his cap. "For now," he said. "But if you hear anything, you be sure to let me know." Tom didn't answer. He just watched as Dale climbed back into his truck and drove off, kicking up dust as he disappeared down the dirt road. Only when the engine faded into the distance did Tom let out the breath he'd been holding. He turned back toward the barn, his mind racing. Dale wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He'd be back. And when he came, he wouldn't just be looking. Tom glanced toward the tree line, where he had last seen the mother bear. Somehow, he knew she hadn't gone far. And if he didn't figure out how to protect her cubs soon, Dale would make sure she never came back. Tom Carter didn't waste time. As soon as Dale's truck disappeared down the dirt road, he turned back toward the barn, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Dale would be back. And next time, he wouldn't come alone. The cubs were still curled up in the hay, their small bodies rising and falling in deep sleep. The falcon, ever watchful, had shifted its perch lower, closer to the ground, as if sensing the growing danger. Tom ran a hand through his graying hair. Keeping the cubs here wasn't safe. Not from Dale, and not from whatever had forced their mother to abandon them in the first place. He needed to find her, fast. A sharp screech pulled him from his thoughts. The falcon. It had hopped down onto the hay beside the cubs, its feathers ruffled, its piercing eyes locked on him. Then, to his astonishment, it spread its wings and turned toward the barn door, as if urging him to follow. Tom frowned. "You're trying to lead me somewhere, aren't you?" The falcon didn't react, but something deep in his gut told him he was right. Without another word, he grabbed his rifle from the corner of the barn, not to hunt, but in case he ran into something worse than Dale out there. He threw on his coat, nodded once at the falcon, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The forest loomed ahead, dark and still, as if holding its breath. Tom took a deep breath and started walking. The falcon took off, gliding low between the trees, guiding him deeper into the woods. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag signs of a struggle. It wasn't long before Tom spotted the first sign. A broken branch. Then another. Claw marks etched deep into the bark of an old oak tree. The further he walked, the clearer it became. Something had happened here. Something violent. Then he saw it. A patch of disturbed earth, scattered with tufts of dark fur. Bear fur. Tom knelt down, running his fingers over the ground. The tracks were fresh, only hours old. He could see where the mother bear had struggled, her massive paws digging into the dirt. But she hadn't been alone. Larger tracks, deep and clawed, ran alongside hers. Tom's chest tightened. Wolves. No, not just wolves. Something bigger. Stronger. His gut twisted. He had seen wolf attacks before, but these tracks were unnatural. Too large. Too erratic. The falcon let out another cry from above. Tom's eyes snapped up just in time to see a shadow shift between the trees. Something was watching him. He gripped his rifle tighter. He knew these woods better than anyone, but right now they felt foreign, hostile. Then, from deep within the forest, a sound rose up. A growl. Low. Guttural. Not a bear. Not a wolf. Something else. Tom's instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he held his ground. He wasn't leaving without answers. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the growl faded. The forest fell silent once more. The falcon swooped lower, circling back toward him. It had led him here for a reason. And Tom had a sickening feeling that reason had just found him. Tom Carter had never been afraid of the woods. He'd hunted in them, worked in them, and lived alongside them for decades. But as he stood in the eerie silence, staring at the massive, unnatural tracks in the dirt, a cold dread curled in his chest. Something had chased the mother bear. Something bigger than wolves. Something that was still out there. The falcon circled above, letting out a sharp cry before landing on a low branch just ahead. It was waiting for him, leading him forward. Tom's grip tightened on his rifle. His instincts told him to turn back, to return to the barn, to protect the cubs. But he needed to know what had happened here, what had sent the mother bear running, what had left these deep, twisted claw marks in the soil. Because if he didn't figure it out now, it would be too late when it came back. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a silent stalker. Tom took a slow step forward, following the falcon's lead. The trees grew denser, the shadows darker. Every instinct in his body screamed that he wasn't alone. Then a sound. Not a growl this time. Not a snarl. Breathing. Heavy. Slow. Ragged. Tom's heart pounded. He swung his rifle up, scanning the trees. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves, masking other sounds. But he could feel it. Something was watching him. Something was waiting. A branch snapped. Tom spun, his finger hovering over the trigger. Nothing. Just trees. Just shadows. And then, a pair of glowing eyes blinked open in the darkness. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had seen wolves before, bears, even mountain lions. But this wasn't like anything he had ever encountered. The eyes weren't yellow like a wolf's or amber like a bear's. They were red, burning, unnatural. Then the shape moved. Massive. Hulking. It stepped forward, just enough for Tom to make out the thick, matted fur, the long, curved claws dragging against the dirt. The creature was low to the ground, but its shoulders alone were higher than Tom's waist. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a wolf. This was something else entirely. Hashtag a deadly choice. Tom's survival instincts kicked in. He could shoot, run, stand his ground. But before he could make a move, the falcon screeched, loud and piercing. The creature flinched, its glowing eyes shifting toward the bird. And in that split second, Tom understood. The falcon hadn't just been leading him here. It had been warning him. This was the thing that had chased the mother bear. This was why she had abandoned her cubs. This was the real danger. Tom took a slow step back, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The creature let out a low, guttural snarl, but it didn't lunge. It was waiting, testing him. The falcon swooped down, circling between them, its wings flaring as if daring the beast to make a move. Tom seized his chance. He turned and ran. Not recklessly, not blindly. He moved fast, steady, controlled. The falcon shot ahead, leading him back through the trees, back toward the barn, back toward the cubs. Behind him, the creature let out a deep, unnatural howl. It wasn't chasing him. Not yet. But Tom knew one thing for certain. It wasn't done with him. And when it came back, it wouldn't be alone.